history doesn't stay buried. It comes back with old photos, forgotten footage, strange headlines, and a reminder that bad decisions used to wear better hats. This is MasonZero's Living Archives. Apollo 13 is remembered as the mission NASA saved. The sharper truth, one routine housekeeping call turned a moon landing plan into a failed landing mission and a survival problem. By April of 1970, the moon had started to look almost administrative. Apollo 11 had landed. Apollo 12 had landed. Apollo 13 was supposed to be the third landing, another Saturn V, another crew portrait, another flight plan moving through a system that had begun to feel repeatable. That is not how the first moon landing felt. But repetition changes the public imagination quickly. The impossible becomes impressive, then familiar, then background noise. That confidence is the first trap in the story. Not arrogance exactly. Something quieter and more dangerous. Competence becoming habit. The crew had a commander, a lunar module pilot, and a command module pilot who joined late after Ken Mattingly was pulled over a measles exposure. An ordinary medical interruption dropped into a moon mission. Their command module was Odyssey. Their lunar module was Aquarius. The names sound poetic. Very soon, they became job descriptions. Apollo 13 lifted off from Kennedy Space Center on April 11th. The launch footage has the old confidence baked into it. Tower, flame, white rocket, bright sky over Florida. And people trusting that a machine taller than a city block can leave the planet because a countdown says so. Even the climb had a warning. The center engine of the second stage shut down early, and the remaining engines simply made up the difference. The burn ran longer, the numbers stayed acceptable, and the mission kept going. That mattered. Apollo could absorb trouble and still look orderly. The machine had already taught everyone the wrong lesson, not that nothing could go wrong, but that wrong could be managed without changing the story. For almost 2 days, the mission looked like work. Mission Control watched numbers. The crew checked systems. The in-flight television tour was calm enough to feel almost domestic. Men floating, equipment behaving, the moon still the destination. It did not have the crackle of a world historical event. It felt like a status report from a program that knew its own choreography. That is what makes the next moment so sharp. The archive gives us the most ordinary request in the whole disaster, a routine call to stir the cryogenic tanks.
13, we've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like it to stir up your cryo tanks.
A housekeeping call should not be memorable. This one became the hinge. Minutes later, the spacecraft shook. The crew reported the problem. Oxygen tank 2 was gone, tank 1 was failing, and the fuel cells that made electricity and water were dying with them. Odyssey had to be preserved for re-entry like a battery everyone was afraid to touch. The moon was still out there, but the landing mission no longer existed. Tiny note from the Department of Bad News, the spacecraft was still flying beautifully. The cameras did not catch the bang in a neat, heroic package. Disaster has terrible stage management. The archive gives us something more useful, rooms full of people after the numbers stop behaving. Mission Control does not look cinematic at first. It looks like men leaning over consoles, paper, headsets, ashtrays, and a silence that has suddenly become expensive. The suspense is not a fireball. It is a room learning what kind of disaster it has before the disaster finishes explaining itself. The cause had a history. Oxygen Tank 2 had once been installed for Apollo 10, removed, modified, and damaged in handling. Before Apollo 13 launched, the tank did not drain normally during ground testing. Engineers boiled off the remaining oxygen with ground power. The trouble was voltage. The spacecraft system used 28 volts. The ground support equipment used 65. A thermostatic switch that should have protected the heater could fail closed. Heat could damage insulation. Then, in flight, a fan stir could turn an old hidden injury into a spark inside a tank full of oxygen. That is the problem with tiny mismatches inside giant systems. They wait politely until they own the room. This is where Apollo 13 stops being a story about bravery in space and becomes a story about a failed plan being rewritten while people are still inside it. The first new plan was survival math. The crew needed oxygen, electricity, water, and a way home. With only minutes of useful command module power left, they moved into Aquarius. The lunar module was built to land 2 men on the moon, not keep 3 men alive for the trip around it and back. Its design lifetime was being stretched from a short landing mission into a 4-day shelter. Oxygen was less frightening than power and water. The lunar module had batteries, but every switch now mattered. Water was coolant as well as drinking water. The crew had to keep Aquarius alive, preserve Odyssey for re-entry, and spend every resource slower than Mission Control could invent the next instruction. On Earth, rescue looked less like a speech than a shift that would not end. New procedures had to be written, tested, corrected, and read up to the crew while the crew were already depending on them. Flight controllers were not simply cheering from the ground. They were turning rooms, simulators, checklists, and arguments into instructions that had to work the first time in space. Ken Mattingly, grounded days before launch, spent hours in the simulator helping finalize the command module power-up procedure he would never fly. That is one of the sharpest ironies in the story. The man removed from the spacecraft still helped bring the spacecraft home. And then the rescue starts looking less like a space program and more like 3 engineers trapped inside a hardware store. The carbon dioxide problem made that painfully literal. The command module carried square lithium hydroxide canisters. The lunar module system needed round ones. The crew had a petty shape mismatch with lethal consequences. Mission Control built a fix with plastic bags, cardboard, hoses, and tape. The result was the famous mailbox. It looked ugly, improvised, and exactly beautiful because it worked. Not a miracle. Not a speech. Just the right ugly answer arriving before the air ran out. The rest of the rescue was less photogenic and more brutal. The command module slept. The lunar module got cold. Water was rationed down to a few ounces per man per day. 1 crewman became ill. Condensation formed in a spacecraft that would eventually have to wake up without shorting itself. That is the part people miss when Apollo 13 becomes a motivational poster. Improvisation is not magic. It is discipline under a deadline with fewer tools than the mission promised. Technically, the moon still did a job for Apollo 13. It stopped being the destination and became the thing Apollo 13 had to borrow to get home. Apollo 13 had already left its free return path for a landing course. Now the ground had to put it back on a path to Earth. The lunar module engine fired a short correction after the explosion, then a longer burn after the spacecraft rounded the far side of the moon. The burn was not just a button press. It was attitude, timing, power, and trust, performed by a crew in a vehicle never meant to be the main engine for home. Star navigation was compromised because debris from the blast made the sky unreliable. So the crew and ground teams used the sun and the shape of Earth as anchors. The images from that passage carry a strange ache, the moon close enough to inspect, Earth small and blue. And 3 men alive inside a machine being used in ways the brochure never promised. Back on Earth, Apollo 13 became public in a way another normal landing might not have. Press rooms filled. Updates multiplied. Officials explained what could be explained and waited out what could not. Families, reporters, engineers, and strangers were suddenly tied to the same question. The country that had begun treating moon flights as familiar now watched a non-landing with a different kind of attention. That is one of the episode's ironies. The mission lost the spectacle it was sent to perform, and only then became impossible to ignore. The story people watched was not conquest. It was uncertainty with a clock on it. Before re-entry, the crew jettisoned the damaged service module and finally saw the injury. The photograph is blunt, 1 panel blown open, machinery exposed, the invisible failure made physical. For days, the disaster had been alarms, pressure readings, procedures, and people trying not to say too much too soon. Now it was visible. You can see why the landing disappeared. You can also see why getting home was not a slogan. It was a narrow legal argument with physics. That is the strange mercy of the archive. Then Odyssey had to wake up. Too much re-entry angle and they could burn. Too little and they could skip away. The command module had been cold, wet, and mostly asleep, but now it had to guide the crew through the only part of the mission it still owned. Every system brought back online was a small wager against moisture, power limits, and timing. Communications blackouts stretched longer than anyone wanted. Mission control waited in silence. The world waited with it. Waiting is not usually treated as action, but on April 17, 1970, it was the only action left. Apollo 13 splashed down in the South Pacific, near the Navy recovery carrier. The recovery footage changes the temperature of the whole story. After black rooms, console lights, checklists, cold spacecraft, and rationed water, there is ocean. There are parachutes. There is a command module bobbing on the water like an answer. Helicopters circled. Swimmers reached the spacecraft. The rescue became physical instead of theoretical. The crew survived. The mission had failed at landing and succeeded at returning. Back on Earth, the review board traced the chain through the tank, the voltage mismatch, the damaged insulation, and the testing history. NASA redesigned the oxygen tank system for later missions, more separation, better thermostats, no stirring fans, and wiring protected differently. That matters because the lesson is not that brave people can outthink anything. That flatters the wrong part of the story. Systems fail in details, and rescue depends on whether people inside the system are still allowed to notice, admit, and adapt. That is the irony of Apollo 13. A mission designed to show that landing on the moon had become repeatable became unforgettable because it could not land. Aquarius saved the crew by never doing the job it was built for. Mattingly helped from the ground because he was removed from the flight. The most memorable artifact was not a flag on the moon, but a square filter taped into a round hole. Success changed its definition in public, and somehow that made the achievement more human, not less. Until next time, remember that history is mostly ordinary people doing ordinary things right before the consequences arrive. The past was not wiser, just less recently embarrassed. Thanks for watching.